Hello guys, I'm Yadagiri and welcome to my channel HVI Tutorials. In this video, I'll explain about TestNG Listeners. So this is the agenda for today's session guys. First, we will look at the basics of the listeners, like what is a listener and why do we need the listeners. And then we will see some of the listeners that are available inside the TestNG. And then how to use the listeners at class level and also at the suite level. And by this point, we will have a clear understanding about the TestNG listeners, right? So then we will jump into the sixth point, that is what is the difference between listeners and annotations. In TestNG, we have something called listeners and we have something called annotations. So as a beginner, when we look at this listeners concept for the first time, we feel like it is similar to the annotations. So what exactly is the difference that we will try to understand? If there is no difference, TestNG will not introduce both the topics, right? So there are some differences. That is why TestNG is introducing both of these topics. So we will try to understand what exactly is the difference here. Fine. So all these points we are going to discuss inside this video guys. So as always, I'm going to explain each and every point in detail. So maybe the video is going to be very lengthy video guys. So please watch this video till the end without skipping any part. If you are skipping any part, probably you don't understand the video completely. So please watch the video without skipping any part. Fine. And one more important thing guys. Here, I'm not going to explain about all the listeners in TestNG. I'll try to pick any one of the listeners inside the TestNG and I'll try to explain you like how to create the listener and how to use the listeners, everything. Fine. And TestNG listeners is one of the important topic in TestNG guys, because with listeners, you can do a lot of things. And in the framework development also, listeners are going to help you in a lot of things. Okay. So TestNG listeners are one of the important topic in TestNG. So please watch this video completely carefully. Fine. And if you feel this video is slow or if you feel the video is very fast, please play with the playback settings in YouTube. Maybe you will just adjust to that. Okay. And yeah, let's get started with the first point. That is, what is a listener in TestNG? Listener is an interface in TestNG guys. Listener is not a class. Listener is an interface that is provided by the TestNG. So if you keep the TestNG aside for 1 minute, just let's understand what exactly a listener in normal scenario. So whenever you are speaking, somebody has to listen to you, right? So we call him as a listener, and the person who is speaking, we call him as a speaker, right? So just consider A and B. A is speaking and B is listening. So we call the A as speaker and we call the B as listener because B is listening to the A. That is why we are calling him as a listener, right? So the person who is listening to something, we call him as a listener. So in the similar way in TestNG also, whenever we execute any test, some events will be happening internally. Whenever we execute any test, our test code will be executed, right? So some events will be happening in the internal TestNG. So if you want to listen to those events, we need some concept. So that concept is nothing but the listener's concept. Fine. Listener, in the name itself you can see. Listener means the person who is listening to something, the person or maybe the thing that is listening to something, right? So in TestNG, the listeners means it is an interface that is listening to the events that are performed by the TestNG guys. So it will always try to listen to the events that are performed by the TestNG. So that is why we are calling him as a listener. Fine. And why do we need the listeners in TestNG? If you want to alter the behavior of the TestNG while execution, if you want to perform any actions during the execution, then we have to use the listeners. And then list some of the listeners available in TestNG. In TestNG, there are so many listeners available guys. So basically I did not count them, but it will be probably more than 20 listeners basically. It's not like 1 or 2. It will be more than 20 listeners guys. So there are so many listeners available in TestNG. But here I'm only listing the few important listeners. So it's not like only these listeners are important, but the other listeners are also very important. But it's just that I'm listing all the very, very important listeners that we actually deal with. Okay. So these are the important listeners that we use mostly in the TestNG guys. So we have something called IAnnotation transformer, IAnnotation transformer 2, IHookable, IInvoked method listener, IMethod interceptor, IReporter, ISuite listener, ITestListener. So each of this listener is having some special importance guys. So each of this listener will perform some different action. So it's not like all of these things combinedly perform some action. So each of this listener will perform some action. So if you want to work with annotation, then you probably need to use any of these listeners. So the first one is going to work with any annotation like test annotation, before test, and all these things. And the second second listener will work with the data provider annotation. So if you want to modify any attribute values in the annotation, and for those things you can use these two attributes, these two listeners. And if you want to hook anything in the middle of the execution, then you can use the high hookable. And if you want to use any method related information, if you want to alter any method related information and all, you can use the I invoked method listener and I method interceptor. So this is like whenever the method is being invoked, you want to intercept and perform some other actions, then you can use this. And then I reporter. So at the end of the testing, you are going to generate some report, right? So if you want to modify or if you want to perform any actions during that phase, then you can go for the I reporter listener. And if you want to perform any actions during the suit level execution, like before suit, after suit, like that, then you can go for suit listener. And if you want to perform any actions during the test execution, like before test, after test, and during the test, then you can go for the test listeners. Like this, every listener has some importance, guys. Every listener has some importance. Okay. So I'm going to pick the ITestListener inside this video, and I'll show you how to use this one. But it's not like only ITestListener is the important one. There are so many important listeners. These are some of the important listeners. So you need to know how to use all these listeners while you are implementing any framework. Fine. So in this video, I'll show you how to use the ITestListener. Fine. So before we jump into fourth and fifth point, like how to use the listeners at class level and suit level, first we need to perform some other actions. So let's look at those actions. Then we can jump into the fourth and fifth. Okay. So let's go to the Eclipse. I'll try to create one package here. So I'll just name it as com.hyr.listeners because we are dealing with the listeners. So inside this, I'll try to create one class. So one more important thing, guys. So as I mentioned, every listener is an interface, correct? Every listener is an interface. That means whenever you want to use the listener, first you need to implement the interface. Usually you don't have any code inside the interfaces, correct? So you need to implement the interface and then only you can use the interfaces. So first we need to implement the interface. So when we implement the interface, what do we call it as? If you implement all the methods inside the interface, then we call it as a class. If you don't implement all the methods, then we call it as an abstract class, correct? So I'm going to implement all the methods. So I'll just name this as ITest class or ITestListener class. Anything is fine. Okay. Just a meaningful name, guys. So whatever the listener that you are implementing, so for that you need to provide some meaningful name. So I'm just providing ITestListener class. That means it is implementing ITestListener interface. Fine. And I don't require any main method. So I'll just click on finish. So the class has been created here. And now let's just minimize this. Now what we need to do, we need to implement the interface, right? Which interface we need to implement? Here we are picking the ITestListener. So this is the interface, right? So let's just write the implementation here. So if you want to implement anything in Java, you need to write implements keyword and then specify the interface here, correct? So the interface name is ITestListener. So while you are writing this interface name, please be careful, guys, because there is something called ITestNG Listener also. You might get confused. So please be careful. So we need to use the ITestListener because I'm going to show you only that one. So I have written this one, ITestListener. So whenever we are implementing any listener or whenever we are implementing any interface in Java, usually we need to implement the unimplemented methods inside the interface, correct? So I'll do one thing, guys. I'll just go to any other package. I'll create one package. So first we'll do some practice and then we'll come back to this one because it will be a little bit confusing, guys, for you. So com.hyr.practice and let's create one interface here. So I'll tell you, okay, it might take 5 minutes or something, but you will get a clear understanding, guys. So I'll just say probably listener interface or iListener. I'll just mention it as iListener. That's it. Okay. So I have some interface called iListener and I want to keep some methods inside this. how do I mention the methods? Void, and I'll just mention it as during test. So I'm just creating one method called during test, and I'm just creating one more method called after test. So some random methods, guys, don't only take the names. Okay, I'm just creating some random names, and one more method as like before test, and maybe some generate method also. It's not like only we need to use the methods like with test and all things, right? So these are all looking like annotations only. So I'll use something called generate. Okay, so like this, I have some methods inside the interface. And now if I want to implement this interface, how do I implement? First, I need to create one class. So I'll just say test class. And how do I implement it? I need to first add the implements keyword here, right? Implements, and which one I want to implement? IListener interface I want to implement. So that is this one, right? IListener interface I want to actually implement. So let's write that IListener. So whenever you write like this, okay, whenever you try to implement any interface, usually Eclipse will show you like this. The type test class must implement the inherited abstract methods from the ITestListener. Correct? So when you mouse over on this, it will automatically show you the suggestion also, that is add unimplemented methods. Because you haven't provided any implementation inside the IListener, it is asking you to provide the implementation inside this class. So that is what a class is, right? Whenever you implement any interface, you need to provide the implementation for all the abstract methods inside this class. Then only we call it as a class. Correct? So I'll just click on this add unimplemented methods. And I'll just minimize this thing. And you can see, so we are getting all the methods that are inside the IListener, right? So whatever the method names I have mentioned inside the IListeners, all those methods are coming with the implementation here. I mean, the implementation is not completely provided, but it is coming with curly brackets open, curly brackets closed and all, right? And just ignore about this comment. So whenever you create a main method also, by default it will come. It's just a comment. So it is denoting like, okay, you need to write down all your statements here like that. So just remove all these things. And now you can provide your code here, and whatever the code that you want to actually execute as part of this method, you can provide that code here, and this will become your class which is implemented by this listener. Correct? I mean interface. So this is how we basically implement any listeners. But here, if you come to the original one, so in the TestNG, we created one class and we added the implements keyword, and we are trying to implement this listener, this interface basically, right? But we are not getting any error here, or we are not getting any suggestion to implement the unimplemented methods. Why we are not getting it? So if you mouse over on the ITestListeners, it is clearly showing that it is an interface only, right? So I symbol indicates that it is an interface. It is an interface. When we are implementing the interface, by default, we should get this add unimplemented methods option here, right? If you go to YouTube and if you search for TestNG Listeners, if you watch any video, probably everybody has shown with this option only, like add unimplemented methods, add unimplemented methods. And even if you go to Google and search for this same concept, probably if you browse any website, all of those websites also will have the same option, like add unimplemented methods. But why we are not getting that here? First, let's discuss this thing and let's close this one first. Let's close this issue first before proceeding further, right? So why we are not actually getting this option here? I'll tell you guys. First, I'll tell you this reason and how to get these things and everything I'll tell you. Then we can proceed with the listener implementations, right? So before Java 8 version, interfaces are not having any implementation at all, right? In Java, you cannot provide implementation inside the interface. You will have all the abstract methods only inside the interfaces. That is before Java 8. But Java 8 has introduced lot of features, guys. You can provide the implementation also inside the interfaces. So that is one of the feature that is provided by the Java 8. But how do you provide the implementation inside this one? So if I try to write like this, it will throw me the error. But how do I provide the implementation? So during the Java 8 version, they have released some keywords. I mean, it's already there, but they have mentioned that if you want to provide any implementation inside the interface, you probably need to use some keywords. So one of the keyword is private. If you use private keyword, you can provide the implementation inside the interface. Or if you provide static keyword, you can provide the implementation inside the interface. You can see when I write static, it is not throwing any error, but when I remove it, it is throwing the error, right? And also one more important thing is default keyword. When you provide default keyword, it will not show you any error basically. You can provide the implementation using any of these three keywords. One is default and the other one is static and the other one is private. So this is the concept that is provided in Java 8 features. Fine, it is introduced in the Java 8 feature. So whenever you are providing the implementation inside the interface, it is no longer an abstract method. It's an implemented method. So even though if you don't write anything, like I'll just write it as like HVR tutorials only, but it doesn't mean like it is not an implemented method. It means like it is an implemented method only, right? Whenever you put the curly bracket, it means it is an implemented method. If you don't put the curly brackets, it's only a defining. You are not implementing it. It's just the definition, okay? But whenever you write like this, it's called implementation. Even though you place any code or not inside the method, it's called the implementation. Whenever you provide the implementation to any method, it will no longer be an unimplemented method or abstract method. Correct? So if you go to the same class, whatever we have created for the practice earlier, so I'll just remove all these things now. And now again, if you try to add all the unimplemented methods, just click on this and you can see we are getting only three options here. I mean, three methods only we are able to implement, right? During test, after test, before test. But how about this generate? Why we are not getting this generate this time? That is because the generate is already implemented inside the interface itself. The generate method is already implemented inside the interface itself. That is why we are not getting that option here. But what if you are implementing all of these methods in the similar way inside this interface? So let's do that. So let's just keep default keyword for all the things. So now we have provided the implementation to all the methods inside the interface, right? So let's go to the test class, which we created for practice. Now, if you see, it is not giving any suggestion. It is not giving any suggestion to add unimplemented methods because every method inside this listener is already implemented. So that is why it is not providing any option to implement the unimplemented methods. So the same thing is happening here also, guys. The same thing is happening here also. So whatever the methods that are provided inside the ITestListener, all the methods are actually implemented. If you look at this, all the methods are having default keyword and the curly brackets. Now, this will not be an unimplemented method, guys. It is a implemented method, but it is not having any logic implemented inside this. Fine, it is a implemented method. Because ITestListener interface is having all the implemented methods, when we try to implement that interface, it is not providing the auto suggestion as add unimplemented methods. Fine. But you might be thinking like how people are showing in the YouTube videos. So they are getting the add unimplemented methods option, and why we are not getting that? That is what your doubt is, right? So let me tell you guys. So before TestNG version 7, TestNG internally uses Java only, right? So TestNG is developed on top of Java only. It has to use internally Java only. So TestNG was using Java 8 below versions. Earlier, TestNG is not introducing any Java 8 features into the listeners concept. But after TestNG 7 version, TestNG has introduced Java 8 features into the listeners concept. So let me just show you that in real time and you can have a solid proof. So let's just jump into the Maven repository and just search for TestNG. And why I'm searching this? Because I want to go to any previous version. So before 7, so even from the 7 beta version only, they have introduced the Java 8 features into the listeners concept. If you go to any of the previous one, let's just pick 6.13. Anything, guys, it's not like only 6.13, any previous versions before 7. Anything you can pick. 6.14.3 also you can pick, okay? So if you open 6.13, so we need to just change this version, right? 6.13. So everything is same. The group ID and artifact ID is same. So I'll just change this version and let's save this. Okay. So it is downloading and the download is completed. So let's just close this and open one more time. Sometimes you will get this error, guys. So just ignore that. It will not be a big deal. Okay. So if you come to this one, you see, now we are getting the option. It is showing that add unimplemented methods. When you click on that, it is trying to implement all the methods that are present inside the ITestListener interface. Fine. So this is the change that happened during TestNG 7 version. From the TestNG 7 version, TestNG is using Java 8 or above features. But before TestNG 7, it was not using the Java 8 features. That is the reason people were getting add unimplemented option inside the Eclipse. But later we are not getting that option. Clear? So let's just remove these things and let's go back to the latest version of TestNG. So what is the latest version? 7.5 is the latest version. And let's just close this. So now you got the clear idea, right? Why we are not getting that option? That is because TestNG 7, after TestNG 7, every version of TestNG is using Java 8 features internally. So in Java 8, every listener is an interface and these listeners are providing implemented methods instead of unimplemented methods. Fine. So now you got the clear information. Okay. But how do we get to implement these methods now? Because the implementation is not actually provided. I mean, it is an implemented method, but the implementation logic is not provided. So I want to provide the logic. So that is the reason we are using the listeners concept, right? If you want to provide your own implementation, then we are going to implement the listeners and we implement our own logic, right? So that is when we are going to use the listeners concept. So now I want to implement all the methods that are present inside the ITestListener. I'll tell you one more point, guys. So earlier it's like you need to implement all the methods inside the ITestListener, but going forward, it's not like that. You can implement only the methods that you want to actually implement, because whatever the methods that you are not implementing, those are already implemented in the ITestListener. Okay, every method is implemented in the ITestListener. But if you want to provide your own logic, then just you need to override it. Okay, you need to override the implemented method. So how do you override it? One way is manually adding it. So just copy this thing and go back to your method and here provide the public keyword and just add override annotation here. Okay, there is an annotation called override that is coming from java.lang. So whenever you write like this, you are actually overriding the implementation that is provided by the TestNG. Okay, TestNG has already provided some implementation, but you are trying to override that implementation. So this is the way you can actually manually add. So if you want to implement only this method, you can manually add like this. But there is an automated way also, guys. If you want to get all these methods, there is an automated way also inside the Eclipse. So what is that? Just right click on this class, whatever the class that you are implementing this interface, right click on that class and go to source and then click on this override or implement methods option. So this option is being provided by the Eclipse. If you are working with IntelliJ, probably the option is different there. Fine. So just click on that and you can see whatever the methods that are actually provided inside the ITestListener class, I mean the interface, all the methods are displayed here. So just pick whatever you want to actually implement or override the logic. So if I want to implement all the methods, then I can just select all the methods here. So I'm just going to, remove this thing. So I don't feel this is very useful. So I'll just remove this and I'll implement the remaining methods. Okay. So now you can see we are getting the auto generated snippet, everything, right? And all you need to do is just remove this code, guys. Don't worry about this code. Okay, let me tell you what exactly it is. So if you don't implement, it is going to take the code that is coming from the listener itself. If you just press F3 on this, you can see it is pointing to the method that is present inside the listener itself. So if you are not providing, if you are forgetting to provide or something, then it will point to the original method. So that is what this code is. Just remove this entire code from every method and then you can add your own code. And let me tell you what exactly this ITestListener is and why we are implementing this everything, guys, now. Okay. So this ITestListener is one interface and it is providing some methods whenever we are executing any test. If you want to perform any action during the test execution, like if the test is failed, what you want to do, if the test is passed, what you want to do, if the test is skipped, what you want to do, and before starting the test, what you want to do. So if you want to listen to these events, then you can use this listener, guys. Okay. So it's basically providing a feasibility to alter the TestNG behavior while executing your test. So based on the test status, like if it is skipped something, if it is failed something, if it is success something, and if it is failed with some timeout error, then something, and before executing that method something, and after executing that method something. So all these things you can actually alter. So TestNG has some default behavior, but if you want to alter the TestNG behavior during these events, you can use the ITestListener interface. Fine. So you can see there are some methods called onTestStart, onTestSuccess, onTestFailure, onTestSkipped, onTestFailed with timeout, and onStart, onFinish. So all these methods are provided as part of this listener, guys. So let's quickly go and implement these methods. So I'm not going to implement very big lengthy of code. So all I'm going to do is just print some statements. That's it. Nothing more. So I'll just write like this. I'll write sysout statement and I'll mention the method name inside that. So whenever this method is being called, this statement will be printed in the console so that we will understand, okay, this method is being called. Fine. Let's add this statement in all the methods and let's just modify these things, guys. So this is one of the important listeners in TestNG, guys. So out of all the listeners also, this is one of the important and commonly used listener. So in which scenario we will use this and all, I will tell you in the last. So let's just change this. Okay. So now this is completed, right? So you can get the information also, guys. It's not like only you need to print this information. While execution, if you want to get the result object. So whenever the TestNG is trying to execute any of your test, it will create the result object. Okay, it will create the ITest result object somewhere. And here, whenever you are dealing with the listeners, it will try to provide you that object with the dependency injection concept. So it will try to provide you that result object. So you can access whatever is there inside the result object. So you can get the name of that, or you can get the status of that. Everything you can get, guys, based on the method. So before starting the test, you will not have any status. But after completing the test and if it is success, you have some status, right? So this is how we can implement our listeners, guys. So this ITestListener we are actually implementing here, right? So whenever you are implementing any listener, first you need to decide which method's logic you want to actually override. So by default, listeners has some default logics, right? So if you want to override any logic, first you need to decide which method logic you want to actually override. That means in which event you want to actually execute some piece of code that you want to first decide. Then based on that, you need to implement the logics. Fine. You need to override the methods basically. Fine. So what exactly we did here? We implemented the ITestListener, we created one class and we implemented the ITestListener and we added some methods that are coming from the ITestListener. So we are overriding the logic that is actually created inside the ITestListener. So all these events I want to actually use. So I'm overriding the logic. So I'm not adding any big code here. So I'm just printing the statements. But instead of the statements here, you can write your own logic. Like if you want to work with a DB, or if you want to work with the Excel sheet, or if you want to work with the reports or screenshots. So whatever you want to do, all those things can be done here, guys. So basically a listener is something that listens to your events. So whenever your test is being executed, some events will be there, right? So your listener is going to listen to those events and it will perform the actions based on that. So for example, here you can see onTestStart is there. So when this will be invoked actually, whenever you are executing any test method, so before executing the test method, before actually the test method execution start, this event will be invoked. So similarly, onTestSuccess, onTestFailure, onTestSkipped, all these events will be invoked after the test method execution. So once the test method is completed, these methods will be invoked based on the test method status. If the test method is passed, then onTestSuccess event will be invoked. If the test method is failed, then this method will be invoked. If the test method is actually skipped, then this will be invoked. If the method is failed with timeout error, then this method will be invoked. So like that, for every event, there is a method here, guys. So for every event, there is a method inside the ITestListener. Fine. So now let's just create some classes and let's test this. So now we have created the class and we have implemented the ITestListener. So it's the time to look at the 4th and 5th points, guys. That is how to use the listeners at class level and how to use the listeners at suite level. So if you want class or if you want suite, first you need to have them in your project, right? So let's create the class and suite also here. So I don't require this practice package anymore. So I'll just delete this. So I'll just pick one class that is already created inside the parallel test. Okay, so that is this test class 1 and I'll place inside this listeners. So I'll just modify this. I am inside test method 1. I'm just refactoring, guys, that's it. Okay, so it has some bunch of methods: test method 1, test method 2, test method 3 and test method 4. Nothing else, guys. It's just a one test class which has 4 test methods. So this thing I'll just copy paste for everything. Okay, so this is done. So whenever you execute this, your listener has to listen to these events, right? So whenever you are executing your TestNG test, your listener has to listen to these events. But let's test it first. Okay, first let me run this. And if you maximize the console, you can see nothing is actually listened, right? Your listener is not listening to this class events at all. So before starting the test and after finishing the test, something has to be printed, right? So that is what we told to listener. So before starting test, you execute so and so thing. You listen to the test and then you execute this. That is what we actually created, right? But it is not happening. Why? Why? Because your class doesn't know what is your listener. Okay, you need to specify that. So I have created so and so listeners. These listeners wants to listen to your events. Like that, I need to specify in TestNG, guys. Okay, if you specify, then only it will listen to your events. If you don't specify, it will not listen. So you have created the listener, you have implemented the listener, but TestNG doesn't know that you have actually implemented the listener until and unless you specify that. You got it? Until and unless you specify explicitly, TestNG doesn't know that you have implemented some listener. So it won't execute any code that is written by you. Okay, it will execute the code that is already present inside the TestNG logics. TestNG base code, whatever the logic is there, that will be invoked. But you want your listener to be listening to this class, right? So you need to specify that. So how do you specify your listeners? So if you are specifying listeners in the class, then you need to use one annotation called listeners. So this annotation you must provide at the class level, not at the test level, guys. You must provide this annotation at the class level only. Okay, so let me just write listeners here. And you can see listeners, that is coming from org.testng.annotations. So this is the annotation that you need to provide and specify your listener classes here. So you can be implementing so many listeners, right? It's not like only one listener has to be implemented. You can implement thousands of listeners. Like, I mean, you have only 20 or 30 listeners in TestNG. So you might implement all the 20 listeners or all the 30 listeners, right? I'm just taking one as an example here. That is ITestListener. But you can implement multiple listeners also, right? So for every implementation, you are going to have one class file because every listener is an interface. So when you are implementing it, you are going to create one class file and you will implement it. So that means you are going to have multiple listener classes, multiple implemented classes. So multiple means it's a collection. How do you represent the collection in Java? You can use any collection framework object or you can go for arrays simply, right? Here also this listeners annotation will accept the parameter or accept the value in the form of class array. That means like this, guys. Class array. It will accept the values in the form of class array. That means you can pass multiple listeners also here. So how do I do that? So just open the parenthesis and close the parenthesis. And inside that, you need to specify the array. If you want to specify the array, you need to open the curly brackets and close the curly brackets. Then you need to specify the classes that are implementing the listeners. So this is one of the class that is implementing my listener, right? So I'll just mention dot class here. Whenever you are specifying the classes, you need to specify dot class. And if you have multiple classes like this, let's say I'm taking the same one again, but if you have multiple listeners classes like that, then you can provide like this. Just use comma separator and provide multiple things like this. But whenever you have only one, you no need to use in the format of array, guys. You can directly specify like this. Fine. So now if you execute, this listener has to listen to your events. That means before starting the execution, it has to listen and it has to execute the respective method. And once the test method execution is completed, it has to listen to that event. Like the test method execution is completed, that event it has to listen, and based on the status of the execution, it has to execute the code. Correct? So let's see. So I'm just passing all the methods, or maybe just I'll fail some methods here. Assert true. Okay, I'll just mention false and no need of message. So I'm just failing with the assertion error. The second method I'm failing with the assertion error, and the third method I'll try to fail with the timeout error. So I'll provide the timeout as 1 second, that means 1000 milliseconds, and within this I'll provide the thread.sleep, because this method has to be executed within 1 second, otherwise it will fail. But this sysout statement doesn't take 1 second, right? So I'm going to just add one thread.sleep here, saying that it has to wait for 2 seconds. So obviously, because I have added 2 seconds of sleep inside this method will obviously fail. So inside the method, I'm sleeping for 2 seconds, but this method has to be completed within 1 second. So it will be failed with the timeout error, right? And the last one, I'll try to add the depends method, because if I want to skip any test, then I need to add the dependent method here, right? So if this method is dependent on this third method, then obviously the fourth method will be skipped. Correct? So now I have added one pass test case and one failure one, and one failure with timeout error, and one skip test. So let's execute this. Let me just right click on this, run as TestNG test. And if you go to the console, you can see the TestNG listener has listened to your events. Okay. Before executing your entire class, it has executed one method called onStart. So the order, you don't worry guys, the order you don't worry here, because the order may be, somewhat up and down things here. So if you see here, onTestStart, and then immediately onTest failed with timeout. That means third method, correct? The third method is executed here first. And when the third method is executed, before starting the test method of the third, so it executed this method, onTestStart event is fired. And then test method 3 has to execute. But that method is not completed within 1 second. So it failed with timeout error. So when failed with timeout error, one new event will be raised internally, right? Timeout error event is raised. When timeout event is raised, your TestNG listener is listened to that one and it executed this method. And next, success. So before executing test method 1, onTestStart is executed and test method 1 is executed. And because the test method 1 is passed, based on that result, it listened to that event and then it executed the onTestSuccess event. Okay, onTestSuccess method basically. And then test method 2, it is failed due to the assertion error. So onTestFailure method is executed. So your listener is listening to all the events, guys. Whenever your test is being executed, it is listening to all the events and it is taking the action based on that event. Correct? And the last one you can see onTestStart, but onTestSkip is printed because the previous, the dependent method is failed. So this method is not executed and it went into the skipped status. So onTestSkipped method is executed. So your TestNG listener is listening to all your events in the backend, guys. Okay, your TestNG listener is listening to all your events. So that is what your listeners will do. So in real-time scenarios, where do we use this? So whenever you want to capture the screenshots on failure, you can use this. So whenever there is a failure, you are executing some code, right? This method will be invoked. onTestFailure method will be invoked. What if you place your screenshot capturing code inside this one? Whenever the test is failed, it will capture the screenshot. That is what we want to actually use in the real time, right? So whenever your test is failed, you want to capture the screenshot. You don't want to place that capturing screenshot code inside each and every test. Correct? So based on the test status, you want to actually capture the screenshot. For that, you are going to use this listener only. So like that, there are so many things that you can do. So you know what exactly this method will do, when this method will be invoked, when this method will be invoked. So if you want to use this method, if you want to perform any action during this event, then you can use this method. You can implement this method and place your logic here. Let's say you want to create the DB connection before test method starts. Then you can use method here, this method. Okay. So like that, you can listen to your TestNG events and take the actions based on that in these methods. Fine. This is how you are going to use your listeners at the class level, guys. And the next one is at the suite level, right? So first let's create one suite. And the suite is nothing but the TestNG XML file, guys. Okay. So I'm just clicking on finish and let's go to the TestNG XML file. I'll remove the thread count because it is useless. So now here you need to specify the listeners. Earlier, if you want your listener to listen to your class, you have specified like this. But now your listener has to be mentioned in the suite level, correct? So then you need to just remove this and go to your suite, and inside the suite you need to specify one tag is there that is called listeners inside the suite, not inside the test, guys. Okay, inside the suite you need to specify listeners, and inside this you need to specify multiple listeners. I mean, if you have multiple listeners, you can specify multiple. So how do you specify multiple? So there is another tag called listener. For every listener class, you need to use one tag called listener. So you need to just repeat this if you have multiple listeners. That's it. Okay. If you have only single listener, just remove these things and use only one. And you can just put the self-closing tag. And you need to specify the listener implemented class here. So this is our class, correct? But you should not directly write the class name, guys. You should not directly write the class name here. So just like how do you mention these class names along with the package name, you are mentioning the class name, right? So similarly, the listener class also has to be mentioned like that. So this is the package and this is the class. So I need to specify like this. Fine. So let's format this. You can see. This is how you need to specify. So here I'll do one thing, guys. I'll just try to split this into multiple tests. So maybe probably 2 tests at least. Test 1 and test 2. I will try to call only few methods inside this and few methods in the other one. Okay. So I have created 2 tests, guys. The test method is different and the test in XML file is different. I have already explained that, right? The test method inside the test class is different and test inside the TestNG XML file is different. Inside one test, you can have n number of test methods, correct? So this is my test case. I have 2 test cases now and I have specified the listeners also here. So if you have more than one listener, just add one more statement here, the same one like this, and keep on repeating your listeners how many ever you have created. Okay. But I have only one, so I'm creating only one. Now just try to execute this. So it's very easy, guys. The same concept, but you need to know how you need to specify this thing. Okay. So there is some error that is coming. Okay, let's just see what exactly it is. ITestListener class was not found in project path. So I have mentioned this one wrongly. So let me just copy this. So now I have corrected it and let me just execute this again. And you can see. So the entire test is executed, and whenever you execute any test with listeners from the class, the output might be different. It's not actually different, but it confuses you. Okay. Whenever you execute it from the XML file and whenever you execute it from the class, you are going to confuse a little bit. So that's why I'm going to show you this one, guys. Okay. So if you just compare side by side. Okay, let me just drag this. So this onStart method will be invoked before starting the test case, not before starting test method, but before starting the test case itself. So before executing the test case, onStart method will be invoked. And then before executing the test method 1, onTestStart is printed. Okay, this is called. And then the test method is executed. I am inside the test method 1. The test method 1 is actually successful. So onTestSuccess is printed. That means inside this one, there are so many methods, right? On test success, on test failure, on test skipped. So the TestNG listener has identified that your test is passed. So it listened to your event and then it executed this method, correct? So this method is completed, right? And then test method 2 is invoked. So when that is invoked, on test start is called first, and then the test method is invoked, and then the test method 2 is actually failed. So your listener listened to that one and it executed on test failure event, and then on finish. So on finish is executed once the test case is completed, and then the next test is going to start. So on start is called, and then inside that 2 methods are there. So before executing test method 3, on test start is executed, and then that is failed with the timeout error. So on test failed with timeout is executed, and then test method 4. The test method 4 will not be executed and it will be skipped because test method 3 is failed. So on test start is executed and immediately on test skipped is executed, and then once the test is completed, on finish is executed. Fine. So if you want to perform any action before the test case and after the test case, like DB cleanup or DB connection or anything, then you can use the on start and on finish methods. And if you want to execute anything before executing the method and after executing the method, then you can go for the on test start and these things based on the status. Fine. So this is how we are going to execute our TestNG listeners at the class level and also at the suite level, guys. Now you got a clear understanding on the TestNG listeners, right? So now let's jump into the 6th point. That is, what is the difference between listeners and annotations? Here, if you see, everything whatever I am talking is like before executing this one and after executing this one, like that I am talking, right? Then what is the difference between listeners and annotations? So there is a difference, guys. So whatever that listener that I have actually shown you, that is somewhat near to the annotations. But there are so many other listeners in TestNG. It's not like only ITestListener is there, right? So there are so many listeners. Like there is something called iReporter. So let's just write iReporter and let me open this. So this is one of the listener, okay? So inside this, there is something called generate report and get config. So these methods will be invoked in altogether different mode, okay? So your listener and your annotation looks somewhat similar, but they both are not similar, okay? Your annotations will be executed based on your test method or class or suite, but your listener will be executed based on the events. Now you see, if the test is passed, on test success is executed. But even though your test is passed or not, what will be executed in the annotations? After test, after class, after method will be executed. But it will not take care of the status, right? Here, based on the status, on test success method is executed. Listener has listened to your event and based on the status, it is executing the method, correct? So it is completely different from the annotation, guys. It is completely different from the annotation. So it's not like only this ITestListener is there. So there are so many other listeners also, correct? So there is something called IAnnotation transformer, right? So in this IAnnotation transformer, you can modify the attributes of any annotation. Like we are having any test annotation, you can modify the attributes of the test annotation in this one. You can modify the attributes of data provider annotation inside this one. Like that, you can do so many things using these listeners. It's not like only these annotation kind of things are present inside the listeners. No, it's not like that. You can do a lot of other things using the listeners, guys. Using annotations, you can do only limited things like before test, after test, before method, after method, before class, after class, before suite, after suite. That's it. Before for and after for. But using these listeners, you can do a lot of things. So they both are completely different, that you need to remember. Fine. And one more important thing is here, you no need to implement the interfaces only, guys. So it's not like you need to always implement the interfaces only. A listener means interface only, but it's not like you need to implement the listeners only. Okay, interfaces only. Why? Because in TestNG by default, there is a class called TestListener adapter. That class has already implemented all the listeners. So if you extend that class and if you override any method, which is exactly equivalent to same thing, this one, okay, even if you implement this method or if you extend the TestListener adapter class, the same thing is going to happen, guys. So let me quickly show you that. So whenever you see anyone is writing extends here, don't get confused. Anything you can do actually, okay? TestListener adapter. So just press Control space, you can see TestListener adapter. So if you open the TestListener adapter and it is implementing which one? IResultListener to listener, okay? If you open this one, this is implementing IResultListener, IConfigurationListener. If you open the IResultListener, it is implementing ITestListener. So indirectly, if you are using this one also, the same thing is going to happen, okay? So if you know the Java concept very well, you will understand this very easily, guys. So now let's jump into the XML file and execute. The same output will be printed. Nothing is going to change. You see, the same output we are getting. Even though I have modified this one, the same output we are getting. Why? Because all the listeners are actually implemented inside this class and we are trying to override those methods. We have a method overriding concept, right? So using method overriding concept, now we are overriding the methods that are actually implemented inside this TestListener adapter. Okay. So it is exactly same thing as how we did in the previous thing. Fine. So any of these options you can use, guys. You can implement the interface directly or you can extend this class and override the methods that you want to actually use. Anything is fine. So that is how we are going to work with the TestNG listeners, guys. So let me summarize one more time. What is a listener in TestNG? Listener is an interface in TestNG. It is not a class, it is an interface in TestNG. We are going to use this interface to listen to the events that are performed by the TestNG. And then why do we need a listener? If you want to perform any operations, at particular events in the TestNG, then we can use the listeners and list some of the listeners available in TestNG. So these are some of the listeners that are available in TestNG. And apart from this, there are so many other listeners also. Now I have shown you, right? So if you open this one, you can see IResultListener 2 is there, which is not mentioned here, right? Like that, there are so many listeners, guys. If you open this one again, IConfigurationListener is there. That is not provided here, right? So like that, there are so many listeners, okay? And out of all this ITestListener, we are using it because I want to show you the demo and that is why I'm using ITestListener. And one more important thing is we are going to commonly use this ITestListener. So even though if you don't use these things, we are going to definitely use the ITestListener, guys. Because if you want to capture the screenshots on failure, we are going to use the ITestListener. Okay, that I will show you in some of the next videos. And the next one is how to use the listeners at class level. If you want to use any listeners at the class level, you need to use one annotation called listeners and you need to specify the listeners on that annotation. And then how to use the listeners at suite level. If you want to use the listeners at suite level, then you need to use one tag called listeners. And inside that, you need to specify all the listeners that are implemented. And one more thing, guys, what is the benefit that you are getting at the suite level other than class level? So in the class level, if you are using any listener, that is only restricted to the methods of these class, right? But if you are using at the suite level, for all the classes that you are actually using here, for all these classes, these listeners will be applicable. Okay, for all the classes, the listeners will be applicable. But here you need to specify explicitly for every class. Let's say I'm using 10 classes inside the TestNG XML file. So for all the classes, I can use this listener. If I'm specifying at the suite level, for all the 10 classes, this listener will be applicable. But if I'm going with the class level, then I need to specify that listeners annotation and add the listener in all the 10 classes separately. So that is a tedious task, right? So that is why we are going to always choose the TestNG XML file, not this one. Fine. And the last one is what is the difference between listeners and annotations? Annotations are limited and they are very clear in the functionality wise. But listeners are not actually limited. There are so many listeners that will provide you different functionalities. Your listener will basically listen to the event, different type of events, not just before test, after test, like that. So annotations are also kind of listener only, but annotations are limited. Listeners are far better than the annotations. And that's it, guys. You can also use the TestListener adapter class also instead of implementing any of the listener interfaces. Fine. So this is the listeners concept. If you don't understand this concept or if you get confused, please watch this video entirely one more time. And even if you don't understand after watching this video one more time, then mention that in the comment section below. Or you can mail me also. Fine. So whatever the doubts that you are having, you can mail me or mention in the comment section below, guys. Fine. So that is for this video, guys. I hope you enjoy this video. If you like the video, please hit the like button and also share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.